I was born and raised in a Presbyterian church, and so from the moment I was born, we went to church every Sunday. We were involved with Sunday school, but it never really hit home for me growing up. I knew the basic stories of the gospel. I knew who Jesus was. I knew the basic contours of what he came to teach, but I would never say I knew him in a real personal way. So when I got to college, though, when I was 18, I went to Florida State University, and I played what I described to my friends as church roulette, which essentially meant the first Sunday, I kind of felt obligated to go to church, but I didn't have any attachments to a particular church. So I just rolled out of bed and went to the first church I could find, the closest church to my dorm. So it happened to be a Methodist church. And again, couldn't tell you what Methodism teaches or why it's distinct from Presbyterianism. But I started going to church there, and it was much the same pattern for a couple of years. I would just go on Sundays, I would listen, maybe be inspired by a nice message, but never really felt deeply connected to what I was hearing or who I was hearing about. But then after a couple years, the guys at this campus ministry, this Methodist church on campus, invited me to get more involved. So they started inviting me to Bible studies. They started inviting me to little prayer groups. And all that was terribly new to me. I'd never really spent a lot of time in personal prayer. I didn't really read the Bible at all myself. So they started inviting me, and I gave them every excuse in the book. Oh, I can't do this. I have homework. I have other stuff I got to do. But eventually they wore me down, and after several weeks of invitations, I took them up on one just to go out to eat. And what I discovered was a wonderful group of guys who were generous, had high character, who were sincere and welcoming. And I was attracted to that. I wanted friends like that. And so I kept hanging around them, and soon enough they sort of pulled me into their small group where they got together once a week to study the Bible. And through that, they encouraged me, you should really read the Bible on your own. We'll help you do it. And so slowly we read a chapter of the scriptures a week, beginning with the Gospels. And it was then, I think, for the first time, I was really captured by the person of Jesus. I was struck by his moral character, by how sort of strange and beguiling he was. I was very familiar with a lot of ancient literature and myth and legend, but there was some distinct characteristic about him that set him apart from all of those. I'd never discovered anything like him before, and quite different picture than the Jesus, the sort of felt board Jesus I had learned about growing up. Here was a Jesus who was sort of dangerous and revolutionary and countercultural and evocative, and so all of that drew me into the scriptures, and I became enchanted with the person of Christ. When I was a kid, I had this conception of God that's popular today, not only among young people, but unfortunately among far too many adults, that God is this sort of jolly Santa Claus in the sky. C.S. Lewis, my favorite writer, says, we like to have our grandfather who art in heaven, who just hopes that everybody has a good time. But then when I read the Gospels and I discovered Jesus, I found a startlingly different character. One, who said things like, in order to be my disciple, you have to pick up your cross and follow me, which would have been an extraordinary claim to first century Jews familiar with the torturous nature of crucifixion. Or, who counsels his followers to love your enemies and to embrace persecution because they persecuted me first. So that sounds far different than sort of the nice, quaint, jolly, let's everyone have a good time sort of God that I grew up with. Now, is God good? Yeah. Is he loving? Indeed. But there's a whole other dimension that you discover in the person of Jesus that's, I think, much more enthralling and challenging. I found that Jesus doesn't just want us to be happy in the worldly sense. He wants us to be joyful and good. He's concerned about our moral development. And I think it wasn't until I realized that in college that I found somebody that I really follow. There's a lot of deities and pseudo-deities in the world who just care about us being happy and having wealth and pleasure and honor and power. But it wasn't until I found something different in Jesus that I found somebody that I could give my life to, a path that I could follow. So I read the Gospels on my own, and then my friends at the Methodist ministry encouraged me to begin praying and taught me how to pray. You know, I was familiar with the basic rote prayers of youth, Our Father, who art in heaven, etc. But they encouraged me to cultivate this personal prayer life where you could meet Jesus as a friend and as a brother and dialogue with him in prayer. And so they got me doing that every day. You know, I would wake up and I would spend a while in prayer, communing with the Lord, telling him about my day, asking him for support, asking him to reveal more of himself to me. And so over several months, I went through this incredible transformation of not really knowing much about the Bible and not really caring much about the church to now being fully enthralled and excited about this new person I had met and who I've communed with. So after that, I began getting really involved at the Methodist ministry. As with many sort of people who have experienced a dynamic conversion or reversion, I was on fire for whatever I could do to learn more about Jesus and to participate in the life of the church. So I started participating in small groups. I started even taking on leadership roles. I would lead sort of small ministries within our campus ministry. And I was even, it got to the point where my pastor invited me to even give messages, like within a year of this whole conversion process. So by my junior year, roughly, I was so committed to living a life following Jesus Christ that I had figured I would maybe pursue the seminary at a Methodist seminary and become a pastor because I was engrossed in what I was learning and I loved to teach and preach, and I thought that was the natural path to follow. But then around my junior year, around this same time, I began having serious discussions with my girlfriend at the time. We had been dating since high school. Her name's Kathleen, and marriage was on the horizon. It seemed pretty inevitable. We were deeply in love with each other. And there was a problem that we were confronted with, though, and it was really the first time we started talking about it as we were getting near our last year of college. What are we going to do when we get married? Because she was born and raised Catholic. I was born and raised Protestant, now really involved with this Methodist church. So what are we going to do? Are we going to go to two different churches? Are we going to go to one church and then the other? How are we going to raise our kids? All these natural questions emerged. So we had this problem, you know, she was Catholic, I was Protestant. We were trying to figure out what church to go to. And it was then I realized I've really never given Catholicism a fair shot. She was the only Catholic I knew. I didn't know anything about Catholicism. And so I thought, you know, out of love and respect for her, my future wife, I should at least check it out and see what it's about. You know, I'd been familiar with some of the sort of Catholic polemics and some of the straw men that people have created around Catholicism. I knew most of those were probably false, but I didn't really know any positive claims about Catholicism. So I spent a while researching. Several months, I poured myself deeply into books on Catholic apologetics. I went into the Church Fathers, which many of my convert friends will readily agree is a big mistake if you're hoping to avoid becoming Catholic. And I quickly discovered that the church of the first century was the church of the 21st century, developed through time, but the church today is the church that Jesus Christ established. And very slowly, after honing in on each of the most troublesome doctrines like the Eucharist, the Mary, the saints, the authority of the church, etc., one by one, each of these kind of fell like dominoes when I became convinced that what the Catholic Church taught on them versus what many Protestant traditions teach was true. And really, for me, the hinge was the real presence of the Eucharist. I had fallen in love with this Jesus. I knew that I wanted to devote my life to him. So I was startled by the extraordinary claim Catholics made that in every Catholic Mass, Jesus comes to us body and blood, soul and divinity. And I realized at that moment, I crave for Jesus. I want Jesus. And if he's in every Catholic church, how could I stay away? But if he's not, this is the biggest farce the world has ever known. I mean, it's indistinguishable from cultic cannibalism, cultic idolatry in a sense. So I really researched this because I felt like this was sort of the crux of the issue. I read John 6 in light of many interpreters, he who eats my flesh and drinks my blood will have eternal life. I went back to the church fathers and tried to determine what did they say about this. St. Paul writes often about the body and blood of our Lord. What did he mean by this? And it seemed to me after all this research unavoidable that what the Catholic Church teaches today about the Eucharist is what the early church believed and taught as well, that when the words of consecration are spoken in Mass, that the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. And that to me was the closing argument. I realized that even if I didn't have everything else figured out, if Jesus was present in the Catholic Church, that's where I got to be. And so it was all sort of downhill from there. Perhaps the most interesting figure in this whole journey was my pastor at the Methodist campus ministry. He was a wonderful man named Vance who had mentored me in my early sort of reversion, my early discovery of the person of Jesus. And so he was always, giving me books to read, counseling me in prayer, etc. And I remembered being very nervous when I walked in his office and said, I'm thinking about exploring Catholicism. I'm not becoming Catholic. I'm thinking about researching it for these reasons. What do you think about that? And surprisingly, he said, I think it's a great idea. Go for it. Many Protestant pastors would have said, no, wait, don't do that. You're going down a dark alley. But he recognized and respected my sort of search for truth and had enough confidence in me that I could follow the truth wherever it led. So he was very supportive. And then kind of as a great turn of events at the Easter Vigil, when I became Catholic, all the confirmandi wait outside before the service begins with the great bonfire preparing for the vigil. And amidst the flames and the darkness of the night, up comes my pastor, who had come to the Mass to support me as I'm entering in the Catholic Church. And more than that, he invited about 30 of my closest friends from the Methodist campus ministry to come to Mass. Many of them had never been in a Catholic church before. So it was a tremendous sign of his character and support that he kind of ushered me down this journey that he probably didn't wholly agree with, but that he felt confident that as long as I followed the truth where it led, he could support that. When I was exploring Catholicism, among the many and various issues, the Eucharist, the saints, Mary, etc., I realized that they all really boil down to the question of authority. Who has the authority to interpret and transmit the teachings of Christ? So when we read John chapter 6 about the body and blood, who has the authority to determine whether that's symbolic or literal? And so I realized that the Catholic Church, like every Protestant tradition, is making a claim to authority. It's claiming that it has the true authority that Christ has established. And so if I could get at the heart of that issue, I figure a lot of the other ones would sort of fall into place. And for me, I think it was the realization that the Church, the Catholic Church, is a divine institution, that Christ passed his authority on to the apostles, and the apostles passed on this divine authority through the laying on of hands through time to the bishops who succeeded them. And so that, I think, really set Catholicism apart from any Protestant tradition I had explored, that here you have a church making the very audacious claim that the authority with which she speaks and teaches is the very authority of Christ. As Jesus says, he who hears you hears me. And I establish my church on the rock of Peter, the Pope, and the bishops who are in communion with him. And so it was to me like an interesting path to the church. Instead of trying to explore every single issue and having all of my intellectual curiosities and obstacles fall into line, if I could simply nail down the authority question, then I could trust the church on all these other issues I was still maybe a little confused about. And so to other converts, I always recommend that sort of strategy is look into the authority of the church. If you can become convinced that this is the church Jesus established, you can trust her voice. You can trust her lead on all these other issues. Yeah, when I was a Protestant, as in many sort of contemporary evangelical circles, the saints were very curious because on the one hand, we read a lot of them. Like people recommended to me books by St. Augustine, St. Teresa of Avila, Blessed Teresa of Calcutta, even John Paul II. So all of these holy men and women we were reading, but we weren't really asking the question, what do they all have in common? How could somebody like Teresa of Calcutta be so right about her holiness, her compassion, her justice, but wrong about the thing that she holds most dear and the thing that she described as the engine of all of her social work, her faith? How could somebody like Teresa of Avila probe the depths of the mystical and contemplative life, but be so disastrously wrong about the church behind it? And so as I began exploring Catholicism, I began asking those questions and realized that the church doesn't stand at odds to their great contribution, to the contributions of the saints, but it aligns with them and acts as the ground for all of their spiritual advancement. So as I began studying, I realized Catholicism shouldn't just be studied in the abstract. I shouldn't just read papal encyclicals and conciliar documents. I wanted to find what it looked like when this Catholicism was lived well, when it was lived best. So I turned to the saints, and along the way, I found a small handful of them who I not only gravitated toward, but I would say befriended. Particularly, I read saints like Saint Therese of Lisieux, the Little Flower, who, of course, died when she was just 24. I was in my 20s during this time, and so I felt a deep connection to her. And she, throughout her life, particularly at the end, experienced questions of doubt and concern, and she wrestled with where her faith was leading her. And so I felt connected to that because I was going through similar struggles. I found Blessed Pier Giorgio Frassati, who remains, I think, my favorite saint, who also died when he was just 24. But he was a young man who experienced all the joys of life. He was a mountain climber. He was active. He had a huge group of friends who followed him wherever he goes. He was a jokester and a prankster, just a great guy that people gravitated toward. Yet at the same time, he was incredibly holy, deeply committed to the Eucharist and prayer and the Rosary. He served the poor of Turin rigorously. He would regularly give the clothes off his own back. And so another person I saw who was very well integrated, who brought all of these elements of the good life together, and not in spite of his Catholicism, but because of it. Then I turned to the topic of prayer. I found Teresa of Avila, even Thomas Aquinas's great works on prayer. I read Julian of Norwich and Catherine of Siena and all of these giants of the contemplative tradition, and found the same thing. Here were people who sat on the bedrock of the Catholic faith, and the theology of Catholicism fueled the genius of their prayer life. It wasn't the other way around. And so everywhere I turned, my favorite writers, my favorite poets, my favorite artists and contemplatives seemed to all share this thing in common, that they were Catholic. And so to me, that was a great ringing endorsement of the Catholic faith. Father Robert Barron has this great analogy. He says, I was a young boy and my dad wanted to teach me about baseball. And what he did not do was throw down a big, thick manual of rules and guidelines, the ins and outs of precisely how to play baseball. And he didn't just sit me down and tell me exactly how to form my swing or how to throw a ball. He took me to the ballpark. And when I emerged from the tunnel and saw the emerald green grass, shining, and I saw the players running, I smelled the dirt, and I got out on the field, I fell in love with the game. And it's only after I fell in love with the game that I began to see how the rules facilitate even more enjoyment of the game. Because if you play a game of baseball without umpires or without rules, it quickly devolves into chaos, anarchy. You don't really get anywhere. But once you have the rules in place, then you have a structure with which to enjoy the game. G.K. Chesterton had another great example in his book Orthodoxy. He said, imagine that there's a bunch of children on an island playing a game, and there's a big gate around the island. When there's a gate around the island, they are free to run about and play in the whole entire geography of the island. They're not afraid they'll fall off, and so they can take advantage of all the land. But now take the gate down, and you'll find if you come back that the children slowly congregate toward the center, huddled and afraid of moving out toward the periphery. And so the gates, although they might seem at first glance to be restrictive, are in fact the very ground for allowing you to enjoy the entire space. Catholicism works the same way. I discovered that the doctrines and teachings of the church are safeguards to living a fulfilling life, that they're not barriers or constricting the joy that you're searching for. They're the boundaries that point you in that direction. Sort of like the banks of a river, they allow your life to flow vigorously in one direction instead of just kind of settling out into this lazy lake. And so that was a huge realization for me, that dogma and doctrine and teachings don't stand at odds to your joy. They're the grounds for bringing it about. Yeah, when I was in college, going through this whole process of exploration, I sort of providentially fell into a talk by Christopher West, who just happened to be stopping by our college campus at the same time. And my now wife, then girlfriend, said, well, let's go check this out, theology of the body, the sexual revolution, the teachings of the church. And so at the time, I hadn't gotten there yet. They were on my checklist, contraception, abortion, the sexual teachings of Catholicism. So I said, let's go, let's check it out. So we went, and that was the first time I was exposed to the writings of John Paul II on the theology of the body, and was completely enchanted by what I found. Here was a celibate elderly man writing from Rome who I thought got the human condition better than anybody I had read. Who understood what it meant to be man and woman, what it meant to be an embodied person, and even more understood the meaning and purpose and value of sexuality. And so that to me was a light bulb. That set me on a journey of reading the Theology of the Body talks for myself and all the secondary literature as well. And I began to see, just like all these other issues, that when I looked at what the Catholic Church taught on sexuality, that our bodies and our sexuality ultimately points to God and serves as a symbolic representation of Christ and the church, as St. Paul taught in Ephesians, that it was sort of an elevated pitch of what many other Protestant traditions were grasping at. They got sort of bits and pieces. They got rays of light that I felt were sort of emanating from this Catholic world, but the Catholic Church, I thought, understood the fullness of what it means to be man and woman and to come together. Also, it was G.K. Chesterton who said, you want to find the real church, look for the church that is treated the same way Jesus was. Fulton Sheen said something similar. Look for the church that the world rejects, and that's the church that Jesus established. And I saw that in these areas, contraception, divorce, abortion, what John Allen Jr. calls the pelvic issues, the world was vociferously against the Catholic Church, unlike any other organization. And so while that wasn't proof that they were right, it at least to me was a good sign that if Jesus was walking on the earth today dealing with these contemporary sexual issues, chances are the world will respond in just the same way that they do to the Catholic Church. Confusion, dismissiveness, rejection, saying those are just antiquated teachings that our contemporary minds have moved past, that's just puritanical rubbish. Let's get past that. I saw the Catholic Church as this stalwart, standing against all of this sort of chronological snobbery that the old has gone away. Let's embrace this new sexual revolution. And so John Paul II's Theology of the Body was the great sort of stake in that claim that the Catholic Church holds to this ancient view of man that's ancient, yes, but ever new. That man and woman in their bodies have value and meaning that's communicated specifically through the sexual act. So the Theology of the Body was a great lure that drew me even closer to the Catholic Church. When I was in college, again during the same exploratory period, it was the first time I discovered The Lord of the Rings. Now, I'd seen the movies, but I hadn't read the books. And so I picked up the books because of the movies and started reading them. And so I had this interesting light bulb moment when I'm discovering all these other Catholic spiritual writers. I'm reading The Lord of the Rings, and then somebody told me, hey, J.R.R. Tolkien was Catholic, right? I'm like, oh, well, that's interesting. I'm sure every writer of every nonfiction or fiction book I've read has some religious persuasions. That's interesting. And they said, no, he aimed to put his Catholicism into that book. And so I later discovered that in a letter, he described The Lord of the Rings as fundamentally a Catholic work. And I was shocked when I first heard that, because I thought, well, where's God? Where are the sacraments? There's no church, there's no Jesus. How can this be a Catholic work? But it was then that I realized the whole thing is covered with Catholic imagery, from the providence of God to grace acting in unsuspecting and pivotal moments, to things like limbus, which is this heavenly bread for the journey, the Eucharist, to Galadriel, this great Marian figure. And so it was by reading Lord of the Rings, I think, that my imagination was being prepared for the Catholic thing. C.S. Lewis said that George MacDonald, a great fictional writer of the 20th century, baptized his imagination. I would say the same thing about Tolkien. Tolkien baptized my imagination Catholic because he imbibed in me the Catholic worldview, kind of like a Trojan horse, where he slips in his Catholicism unknowingly, unsuspectedly, and then by the end, you now have a new lens for seeing the world. You approach things like providence and grace and the sacraments with a new view, a Middle Earth view, because you've been enthralled in this world. So Tolkien was a pivotal figure because I think he illuminated the Catholic artistic imagination for me and sort of opened up a space where the rational apologetic arguments could fit. It wasn't long when I was exploring Catholicism until I discovered the intellectual riches of the church. Unfortunately, most of my early experiences, like visiting Mass and going to Catholic churches, were the typical experience most of us have on a Sunday morning. People going through the motions, people not really intellectually engaged. And so that was my view of Catholicism until I started reading these great theologians, philosophers, doctors, and church fathers, and found an extraordinary treasure chest of wisdom. To me, there's no tradition in the West that can match the Catholic Church's intellectual lineage. And that's clear to anyone who even samples, say, the writings of the last 1,000 years from the Catholic Church. So I began reading people like St. Thomas Aquinas, very trepidly and probably very ignorantly. I started making my way through the Summa Theologiae. Began reading Augustine, both his Confessions memoir and his interpretations of Scripture, his homilies on Scripture. I began reading the Church Fathers, people like Ignatius and Polycarp and Origen, and found incredible insights into the Gospels that I had already found and loved. More contemporary, I began reading the popes, people like John Paul II and perhaps most emphatically Benedict XVI. And I found somebody whose mind was so given and converted to Christ that it didn't stand in conflict with his Christian faith. It wasn't like he had this experiential and emotional and intuitive religion that was at odds with his extraordinary intellect. Instead, the two were synthesized. And to use the great phrase of John Paul II, someone who discovered that faith and reason are like two wings on which we ascend to truth. That if you just flap with one, you're eventually going to sink. But these two things flapping in and sync with each other rise to the fullness of truth. And so it was then that I thought, well, this is something I could be a part of. I didn't want a faith that was anti-intellectual, that was afraid of the difficult and most pressing moral questions of our day. I wanted one that went right into the belly of the beast and challenged the greatest thinkers, the greatest philosophies, the most prominent worldviews, and fought them toe to toe and emerged victorious. And that's what I found in the Catholic Church. So when I was a evangelical in college, like many young evangelicals then as now, I was really passionate about social justice. Our pastor regularly encouraged us that to love Jesus means loving those whom he loves, the poor, the oppressed, the marginalized. And so we had lots of ministries in our campus ministry to reach out to poor children, to go to the Boys and Girls Club, to bring sandwiches to the homeless, to take care of immigrant families, etc. So we were doing a lot, and that was ingrained in me. I just felt to be Christian means to do these sorts of things. But then as I began exploring Catholicism, I noticed quickly online and in conversations with new Catholics I was meeting that if I used the word social justice, it was like alarm bells going off. Like that was a very dirty phrase. We didn't talk about that. And I discovered that, it's because it had a checkered past. It was misunderstood, misinterpreted, distorted, abused by many people for many bad purposes. For many people, it connotes socialism or communism or Marxism. But on the other hand, I was troubled by the fact that that phrase, social justice, appeared in all of the magisterial writings that I was reading. I later did a study and found that over the last 100 years, the phrase social justice appears no less than 120 times in the papal encyclicals and conciliar documents. So this is something the church cared about and wanted to practice, but it just didn't have a good reputation on the ground. So when I became Catholic, one of my focuses was on the social teachings of the church. And I found sort of an intellectual grounding for the practices that I had already discovered as an evangelical. So for instance, I found what it would look like to form a just society, that it's not just about bringing sandwiches to the homeless or helping poor children, but it's about forming a society where a lot of those injustices aren't present because they're taken care of at a systematic level. I saw the delicate balance between charity and justice, between personal hand-to-hand service, which all of the saints embodied and championed, and social justice, institutional and systematic justice. Reading people like Pope St. Leo XIII and Pope John Paul II, the writings of the Second Vatican Council, many sort of encyclicals on economics and political theory. I discovered a church that had thought very carefully about these issues. It wasn't just partisan or political. It was measured and thoughtful analysis of what it takes to build a just society. And I deeply appreciated that. John Paul II has this phrase that the church is an expert in humanity, which sounds a little bold and arrogant until you realize that what other institution has had this much human experience? Thousands of years of the ups and downs of every society, every government, every culture that the world has known over the past several centuries. And so it has a keen understanding of what works and what doesn't work. And Catholic social teaching coalesces that wisdom into this beautiful, if mostly undiscovered package. So Catholic social teaching, like the theology of the body, like the saints, like the church's authority, was another lure that drew me into the church. I wanted to be a part of a church that understood what it took to build a just society and had the saints who actually did it. When I was on the verge of becoming Catholic, I'd researched all these issues, Mary, the saints, the Eucharist, and felt convinced by the Catholic view. So I felt good about everything I had studied. But then I learned that when you become Catholic and go through the confirmation process, that you commit to holding all that the church teaches now and in the future. And so I thought, well, what if tomorrow the church says the sky is orange, or dogmatically teaches that Jesus is just a man who had a wife and 4 children? How could I put myself in such a precarious position to agree to everything the church teaches now, including stuff I haven't studied, or everything she teaches in the future, which I obviously have no idea what it could be? But that's when I came back to this grounding issue of authority. Once I became convinced that Jesus Christ established the church and imparted to that church his divine authority, not just a human institution that he handpicked a couple of human leaders and said, have at it, a divine institution guided by the Holy Spirit down through the ages to today. And once I connected that institution to the Catholic Church, that the two are one and the same, then my anxieties were relieved. I thought this isn't just a church that arbitrarily and willy-nilly defines teachings left and right on its own whim. This is a church guided by the Holy Spirit today, prevented from speaking and teaching error on faith and morals, and continuing to speak with the very voice of Christ. And just as I would never expect Christ himself to teach error, he is the way, the truth, and the life, so his church can't err. And so it was an audacious leap in a sense, because you're requiring trust in this institution, but it's also not a sort of fideistic, groundless leap. It's a leap grounded on your trust that the church is a divine institution that's continually guided by Christ and His Holy Spirit. So after I became Catholic, I was Catholic for a couple of years, still trying to find my way, and I'd read lots of apologetical books, but found that many of them were aimed at Protestants, helping evangelicals make the jump to the Catholic Church, or engaging sort of the fundamentalist critiques of Catholicism. And those are great. For my own journey, they were really helpful, going from evangelicalism to Catholicism. But I soon realized on the ground as a Catholic that the church faced a far more pressing concern. It's not Protestantism that's challenging faith today. It's secularism. Not the idea that which Christianity is right, but is Christianity true at all? Why should we believe in Jesus? And even more fundamentally, why should we believe in God? And I discovered these, new atheist writers, people like Richard Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens, who recently passed away, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, people who were describing religion and faith not just as simple and innocent, but as dangerous, as poisonous, as something that should be purged from society, not just from private lives, but from the public realm too. And so I recognized that we really need to engage this secularism, which takes the form most often as atheism. And so I created a website to do just that. It's called strangenotions.com. It takes its name from the 17th chapter of Acts, where St. Paul goes to the Areopagus in Athens, Greece, which is sort of the hub of the ancient intellectual world, and engages a group of pagan philosophers. He pronounces Jesus risen from the dead, and they say, "You bring some strange notions to our ears. We want to hear more about that." So strangenotions.com is designed to mimic that encounter and bring Catholics and atheists in dialogue about the big questions of life. Things like, how do we know God exists? Does He exist? Are faith and science in conflict? How do we know that Jesus was divine? How can we believe in the resurrection? A lot of these fundamental questions that we could take for granted 100 years ago, but they're far more pressing today. So some of the most common ones include things like, there's no evidence for God. You'll hear the cry of evidence, evidence, whenever you talk about God. Bertrand Russell, the famous atheist, said that when he died, if he discovered that there was a God, the first thing he would say is, "Why didn't you provide more evidence?" And so as a Catholic, I studied a lot of the great defenders of the faith, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Anselm, St. Augustine, Pope Benedict XVI, and many contemporary philosophers, and discovered an abounding wealth of evidence for God. Many of it takes the form of philosophical argument for God, most famously in Thomas Aquinas' 5 Ways to God. But we also have the evidence of Jesus' resurrection from the dead, historical evidence for the person, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, miraculously. We have the evidence of personal experience of millions of people who have met and encountered the Lord in a personal and real way. And so, to me, the evidence is overwhelmingly in support of theism. We just have to communicate that in fresh and new ways to many people who doubt it. Another argument that I've heard time and again is that science has disproved God, as if God was some physical, empirical being within the universe that science could definitively rule out, which is, of course, far from the case. Science is not even the right tool to detect the existence of God. Science is only concerned with natural, physical discoveries and research, and God is, by definition, an immaterial, transcendent reality outside of space and time. And so it wouldn't make sense to suspect that science could discover or even converge on the existence of God. Now, we do use science to support belief in God by using things like the origin of the universe to furnish philosophical proofs for God. So science can serve as support for philosophical premises that lead to theological conclusions. So science can lead to philosophy, can lead to God. but we don't say science can directly find or detect God. So anytime someone tells me science has disproved God or science is in conflict with God, I challenge and push back vigorously, saying it couldn't be further from the truth. Another thing that I discovered in talking with a lot of these atheist friends online is that theological objections to God are often moral objections in disguise. Now, what I mean by that is many of my atheist friends will say, I could never believe in God because there's no evidence for him, or science has disproved God. But really, after digging a little further, you find that what they really object to is, say, the Catholic Church's teaching on homosexuality or abortion or divorce or contraception. And they could never embrace a faith that prohibited those practices because they enjoy them themselves. And so they understand, quite rightly, that if God exists and if he established a church that speaks in his name and has certain teachings on these issues, that their life is going to have to change in a radical way. And they're not prepared for that change. And so they sort of justify their disbelief with these claims for evidence or these or rejections for the arguments for God. And so what I've discovered is that we Catholics need to present the Catholic view, not just from a philosophical perspective. Arguments are very helpful indeed, and I don't believe for a second the old claim that arguments have never converted anybody to God. I can tick off a list of many people who have been. But at the same time, we need to bring in the sort of anthropological arguments for God. These are more Augustinian, St. Augustine, who in his Confessions, which is essentially one whole book making this argument, he pictures God not as the result of some philosophical conclusion, but as the deepest longings of our heart, that you hunger and thirst for some transcendent beauty beyond you, and that beauty is found in God. You hunger for this transcendent truth. We're not satisfied with half-truths. That truth is found in God. You want goodness, you find it here and there. You find some good people, but you want the perfection of goodness. That longing is a longing for God. And so if we kind of skirt around the philosophical issues and instead target what people are longing for, we can sometimes make a far more compelling case for God. I'm often asked that question, why did you become Catholic? It's such a strange and countercultural thing to do today. And I always respond the same way that G.K. Chesterton did when he was asked why he became Catholic. He said that the difficulty in explaining why I became Catholic is that there are thousands of reasons which all ultimately amount to one, because Catholicism is true. And I think as seekers of the truth, whether we're atheist, agnostic, Protestant, Catholic, we should follow the truth wherever it takes us. However uncomfortable, whatever changes it means in our life, we should seek after the truth. And so for me, that meant exploring what the Catholic Church taught and finding whether it was true. And in each case, every sort of nook and cranny, every cave I dived into, every ocean I explored, I found that the truth emerged, and the truth had a name, and it was Catholic.